All right, James. We were talking. I remember we did a video about dominoes in order to lead into the war game you developed. That we're still going to do more videos on the combat phase of. But for now, it got into a little bit with Tamerlane, right? And one of my one of my watchers, Nessiesearcher, he mentioned because you had mentioned him as well, Harold Lamb,
Yes.
the biographer of many of the world's greatest conquerors. So we thought, as a lead into a few things, eventually we're going to do the Tamerlane video. And you had said you had listened to the audiobook of his stuff 6 times in January.
Tamerlane, Conqueror of the World, or Tamerlane, Conqueror of the Earth, I think is the name.
Oh, that's a cool.
It's a biographical novel.
What year?
I don't know. I believe Harold Lamb wrote in the teens.
The teens. Yeah, that's a good time.
Okay, in the early 20s.
Okay.
My impression is he wrote for teenage boys of his era. He wrote a series of fantasy books. I think one of the titles was Durandal, which might have been the name of Rowan's sword, which I should know because I've listened to the Song of Rowan so many times. But every sword had a name in the Song of Rowan.
Oh, that's cool.
That Harold Lamb was Robert E. Howard's favorite author. And Robert E. Howard, there was an entire collection of Oriental novels he did set in the late Middle Ages and early modern era, in which he was essentially aping Harold Lamb. His best one was Lord of Samarkand, which was a brutal Frankish view of Tamerlane, which was not a flattering view, and it was a view of Tamerlane in his last years. I believe the novel about Genghis Khan was titled The Wolf Chaser, and I was introduced to Harold Lamb by Art Richardson, who was my advanced placement history teacher in 9th grade. Okay, yes, I was a special ed student for 3 years in elementary school. Did not learn to read until I was 10, but by the time I was 11, I was reading as a junior in college. So something happened in that special ed class. The lady did, I don't know how she taught me how to read because I still don't understand how the English language is used.
DNA.
But Art Richardson sees me walking into his class with a Conan book.
Oh.
Okay, but I'm the dummy in this advanced placement class. I got there by my reading qualifications. I can't do any of the coursework. It's going to get me bumped and down phased to the point where the following year I get a pass to the library, and then for I just spend like my last 6 months in high school in the Trinity High School library, and I've got a library pass from every single teacher who can't stand me bringing history books to their class,
right.
Particularly if it's the history class. But the one that got me started down this road was Art Richardson. He said, "I've got the book for you for your book report, Alexander of Macedon, a novel, a historical novel about Alexander the Great by Harold Lamb." And he was right that it would appeal to me because he could see what kind of meathead stuff I was reading. I was reading, Conan the Barbarian and Conan the Wanderer and so forth. So Art knew, his students, and he obviously had a clue that these two writers were related. Howard basically aspired to be the next Harold Lamb. When I was down in that library, I found a book on the Crusades. A straight-up history book, not a biographical novel like The Wolf Chaser, like Alexander of Macedon, like Tamerlane, Conqueror of the Earth. No, this was just titled The Crusades. It was by Harold Lamb, and I read every book on the Crusades in that library, and then some that I bought at bookstores later, and that was by far the best. It makes sense. The guy was a novelist. Okay, so like Barbara Tuchman wrote the best history of her era in the 60s and 70s. Harold Lamb was no different, a half a century or more earlier. The interesting thing, Harold Lamb had some footnotes in his book on Timor, who he didn't call Tamerlane. It was in the title. We can get into that in another video, but he had footnotes. He described, I know nothing about Harold Lamb. I don't do searches.
Right.
I don't go online. But he describes in a footnote of how he handled a Mongolian composite bow in the museum in Peking.
Oh, cool.
So he sounds like an old hand.
Right.
There was, I might have given it to you, or I might have given it to Manny, I don't know. I had a book of Chinese poetry translations that started in about 320 BC, which had been during the time that Alexander was campaigning. I used it for some research, and I didn't need to get too far through it. I just needed the first, like, dozen poems. This Harold Lamb guy spent time in China in the late 1800s or early 1900s and had access to this museum. So I have no idea who he was, but he was somebody, and he reminded me in his attitude of that old Chinese hand, that English guy, that British guy that had translated all those Chinese poems from antiquity. So I was very fascinated. He has a very sympathetic Orientalist view of his subject matter.
Oh, sounds like
and he was pretty much like Will Durant in his Our Oriental Heritage, which was a huge history book like this big that was written in the 1930s. So Lamb was, he was not a British Empire fanatic. You know, he wasn't a Kipling.
Was he an American or a British guy?
I do not know.
Okay, all right.
Okay, but it makes me wonder, because this guy, how did he get access? How did he get over to Peking and get access to this museum? And I don't know really anything about his history other than the books of his that I've read. So Alexander of Macedon is still available in mass market paperbacks every once in a while. I recommended a volume of this to my roommate's two young sons because it appealed to me quite a lot as a younger teenager. Lamb did a very good job of getting in the head of a teenage Alexander, the guy that was going to end up conquering the known world. You know, he managed to get in his head. I did not realize at the time that the main focus of, at least what's extant now, the main focus of his historical fiction was the great conquerors. And he does rate the great conquerors of history in his book on Tamerlane. And he rates Alexander and Genghis second and third. I forget which one got third place. His point was Genghis Khan, and yes, he had to fight for his life. His father was murdered. He had to murder his own brother. He had to pimp his wife out to some Central Asian empire or whatever. Whatever he had to do. Once he finally gained control of the Mongols, it was like a man of 1,000 years later gaining control of the Goths or the Sarmatians. He's now at the top of the baddest tribe of barbarians out there. Okay, so now he's just got to be really good at wrangling his relatives and his kinsmen. And he's got to stay on the front line because there's a lot of treachery here.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? 3D chess player, you know, so Genghis Khan has got to be a total genius on multiple levels. Alexander the Great had, other than the inheritors of Shaka Zulu, who murdered him, his nephews, I think, murdered Shaka Zulu. Other than those guys, Alexander the Great and Ogadai Khan, who was, I think, the nephew of Genghis Khan, who ends up getting, I think it was either Baku or Ogadai, both of them inherit.
I think his guys are the ones that got to Europe.
Right, so other than Ogadai and Baku, and the murderous nephews of Shaka Zulu, the only person in history that inherits the best military system in his milieu is Alexander of Macedon, because Philip of Macedonia, other than Shaka Zulu, is the only person who has designed his own military from the ground up.
Yeah.
And he's used other examples. He's been a prisoner of war and highly successful infantry-based military states. He's grown up amongst a very good cavalry-based aristocracy. He can look at the yeoman farmers that labor for his own horsemen and see men that would be even better hoplites than the hoplites he studied when he was the prisoner of war in Thebes. And he can put it together in his mind and say, you know what? I put all of these moving parts together. I've got an unbeatable machine. And he gives that to Alexander. Now, Alexander didn't conquer the entire known world. He conquered the entire wealthy known world.
Yeah, no,
okay. He didn't even bother with Romans because they didn't have shit. Yeah, right. Yeah. So Lamb elects Timur as if all three conquerors started out with the same material, and they all had to start out with the same 5 guys that Timur started out. Timur started out with his five childhood buddies. That's what he started out with. His dad was in a monastery praying to Allah. Right. That's it. He had him and his 5 buddies.
What was Tamerlane again? He was not a Mongol.
He was a Tartar. Okay, so which broadly means North Central Asian.
Right.
He's not a Turk. He's not a Mongol. He's not an Arab. He's a Tartar. He is one of the groups of people that were used as the frontline soldiers by the Mongols.
Yeah.
Now, once they start gobbling up the Turks,
right,
they start selling a lot of these Turks to the Arabs as mercenaries, as slave soldiers. Mamluk means slave soldier. And these are mostly Turks. The Tartars were kept as like the frontline vassal lackeys of the Mongols. And we should do a separate video on Timur, but he was essentially a geographic nationalist. He was a kid that grew up being the best of the kids around him, and Dad, who was a chief, decided to go to a monastery, which he didn't like. Timur didn't like the fact that his father basically quit. He was a chief. And he went to a monastery. Now Timur's basically got to start out like any mobster in 1910.
Right.
Okay. So he didn't appreciate that, but he could appreciate his father's predicament, because there would be nothing more humiliating than being a minor chieftain of the Tartars when the Persians came north and the Arabs came north with their superior claim on religiosity, and the Turks outnumbered them and were more criminalistic, and the people from India, they had more numbers, and then you had the arrogant Chinese on your border that were like jacking up prices.
That's right.
Okay, and then you got the Mongols that come down every 4 or 5 years and they tax you.
Yeah.
Okay, which means they take all the most beautiful women. Right. And what are you going to do? Okay, so this is like being like some guy from like the smallest slice of Italy that's stuck in some crappy Eastern American city in 1910, trying to figure out how you're not only going to deal with the Irish and the unmentionables and the government and the Sicilians and the Neapolitans and the Anglo elite, and you're maybe from Corsica or
Calabria,
right? I mean, you're from some just like
Abruzzi.
You're from like the heel of the boot, or so you're like a Torontoese or some whatever the hell they call that, right? So this was his position. So for that reason, since the only person that conquered more geography than him was Genghis Khan, okay, he rated Timur as the greatest conqueror.
Yeah, because he probably started with the least. With the least amount, and he got a lot. So, yeah, I tell you, real quick, I'll just say, like, growing up, I never even heard of Tamerlane until I started going to the library and reading about Central Asia, and I was fascinated by this guy, that he had a huge impact across Asia, from China all the way to Europe, and you never hear this guy mentioned. Although, if you start getting into poetry and Poe. and you know, the old was it Christopher Marlowe plays. Then you start hearing about this figure, Tamerlane. But anyway, more on him in another video.
Sure.